Church, I have to tell you, you are a beautiful sight. I have a question for you. Why does Jesus ask so many questions? And Jesus has a question for you. Actually, Jesus has 307 questions. That's right. In the four Gospels, Jesus asks 307 different questions. No, I didn't count, but someone did that for me. By startling contrast in the Gospels, Jesus is asked only 183 questions. And get this, of the 183 questions Jesus is asked, he gives direct answers to only 8 of those questions. I did count those. Now let's do the math. That means that for every question Jesus answers directly, he asks 38 questions. Here's another way to put it. Jesus is almost 40 times more likely to ask a question than he is to give a direct answer. Now, this is more than an intriguing factoid. Asking questions is central to Jesus' life and teachings. He is a questioner. In the United Church of Christ, we love the comma. It may be our favorite punctuation mark because it reminds us that God is still speaking, which of course is an updated version of what John Robinson, the pastor of the Pilgrims, said as he sent them off on their voyage. He said, "There's yet more truth and light to break forth from God's holy word," which, by the way, is the inspiration of the anthem we're going to hear after the sermon, which was original composition from Jeffrey Hager, especially arranged for this General Synod. But we love the comma. At this General Synod, we're having a bit of a flirtation with colons. God's vision, colon. But for the most part, we still love the comma. Other traditions favor different punctuation marks. Fundamentalists insist on periods. Pentecostals are ecstatic about exclamation points. The disciples have a trademark on parentheses. For those of you who don't get that, it's the Christian church, disciples of Christ. And have you noticed that it's more difficult to get a hyphen these days? Have you ever asked why? The Episcopalians are buying them all up. So we favor different punctuation marks, but Jesus' favorite punctuation seems to be the question mark. In Jesus, God is still asking. 307 different questions. It is telling that the very first words Jesus speaks in the Gospels are in the form of a question. According to Luke, Mary and Joseph lose track of their 12-year-old son Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem. When they eventually find him, this preteen Jesus asks 2 questions. Why are you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? At the other end of Jesus' life, according to Mark and Matthew, his last utterance while on the cross was yet another question. My God, why have you forsaken me? We might assume that if ever there were a time when Jesus would stick to simple declarative sentences, it would be after his resurrection. According to the Gospels, however, even the risen Christ keeps asking questions. Whom are you looking for? What were you talking about along the way? Do you have anything here to eat? Do you love me? Contrary to how Jesus often is portrayed, he does not provide easy answers. Instead, he asks hard questions. He is not the ultimate answer man, but more like the great questioner. He is like the Zen master who asks questions to take us beyond the obvious to something deeper. He is like Socrates, who taught the people simply by asking probing questions. He is like the prophets, who railed against the ruling authorities and sought justice by asking challenging questions. One of the great saints of the first church I served would comment on the mysteries of life by saying, when I meet Jesus, I will have a lot of questions for him, but might Jesus also have some questions for her? We hear the affirmation in gospel songs and read it on bumper stickers, Jesus is the answer. But might Jesus also be the question? A friend tells of being in a class of a legendary professor of theology who completed his final lecture to a standing ovation. The professor picked up his notes, hastened them into a folder, and headed out of the lecture hall. At the doorway, he turned around and faced the applauding students. The class fell silent, listening for a parting word. The professor took in the class with his eyes and said, just remember, Jesus is the question to all of your answers. And with that, he left. Jesus is the question, and he asks so many questions. Some of those questions are simple, straightforward. Others are profound. The question in our scripture today, do you see this woman? Is the kind of question that at first can seem straightforward, but actually is quite profound. Jesus asked this question while he is a guest at a dinner party at the home of a Pharisee named Simon. Most Pharisees seemed quite suspicious of this renegade young teacher, Jesus. But Simon, whether out of curiosity or true hospitality, has invited Jesus to his home. While they are at table, a woman who is described only as a sinner crashes the party, falls at Jesus' feet, and begins to bathe his feet with her tears. She also lets down her hair, a most intimate gesture that would be taboo for women of the time, and she uses her hair to dry Jesus' feet. Her actions only add to the scandal of her being there in the first place. Because this woman is known as a sinner, she is an outcast. People in polite company would have nothing to do with her. Upright people would act as if she does not exist. These conventions are so strong that Simon simply assumes that Jesus must not recognize that she is a sinner. Simon concludes that Jesus does not see the woman for who she is, because if he did, he would treat her as if she were invisible. So when Jesus asks, "Do you see this woman?" it is not a simple question. Rather, it is a probing and challenging question. The woman may be right in front of them, but that does not mean they all see her. Sometimes people choose not to see. There is, after all, a cost in seeing. If you see this woman, actually see this woman, you might need to move beyond the stereotypes and the preconceptions. You might have to relate to her as a person, one soul to another soul. You might have to respond to her with compassion. You might even see that she mirrors God. Simon only sees what sort of woman she is. Jesus does not see a sort of woman. He sees this woman. He also challenges the others to see her as well. That seems an apt description of our charge as followers of Jesus, to see people that others do not see. And that also describes very well the particular legacy and mission of the United Church of Christ. We aim to see people that others may not see. The oppressed, the marginalized, the forgotten. And to challenge others to see them as well. There's a lot to this business of seeing and being seen. Pam Emsley, one of my colleagues in the church I serve, frequently uses the phrase "to be seen" to describe a basic human need. It is the need, as well as the desire, to be understood and valued. Everyone wants to be seen, she reminds us. She articulates one of her primary goals in working with the youth of our church is that she wants them to feel truly seen. If someone in the congregation is particularly grumpy, Pam will say she just wants to be seen in her unhappiness. If someone else has drifted away from the church, she'll offer this explanation: I don't think he felt seen here. My colleague goes on to conclude, you can't fake truly seeing another person. People know if you really see them or not. When you truly see them, you find their note, their vibration, their connection with God, and you dance with them right there. But it's not always easy to see another. To see someone in the fullest sense requires a receptivity and openness to the other, just who they are, as they are, and that is often beyond us. Most of my early life was spent within the gravitational field of New York City, and a good deal of time in the city itself. A while back, I was going to see a play with some friends from other parts of the country, and so they are less familiar with the city's sometimes strange and difficult ways. As we walked to the theater, I had a certain spring in my step. After all, I was with people I enjoy. The exhilarating rhythms of the city were all around us, and I had in my pocket tickets to the hottest show in town. To get to the theater, we had to walk through a somewhat tough neighborhood. No problem, I assured my companions. I've done it many times. Conversation flowed. There was much laughter. And then I suddenly realized that my companions had become silent. Something had obviously happened, but I didn't know what. Then one friend said, Did you see that woman? She looked like a prostitute. Did you see the way she was crying? Everyone else immediately responded, obviously struck by the same sight. We walked the next few blocks in silence. The reason for my silence was probably different, however. I had also seen the woman who so haunted the others, but in a sense, I didn't see her at all. Somehow, in all the times I had walked in that neighborhood and ones like it, I had lost some of my ability to see. Do you see this woman? Of course. She's right in front of me. No, I mean, do you actually see this woman? Well, no. Not really. On another occasion, this time in a suburb of New York, I stood with another friend before the enormous front door of the big house, waiting for someone to let us in. In some ways, it looks like a gracious manor house that had seen better days. A proud dowager who is now a bit down on her luck. From where that house is perched, there is a privileged view of the stately Hudson River. The same river that has inspired so many artists and once drew the Roosevelts, Vanderbilts, and other famous families to build grand mansions on its banks. Finally, someone dressed in a uniform opened the door and summoned us inside. There in the entranceway, we were asked to sign a book. Something like an enormous guest book, heavy as a millstone, with yellowed pages that must have gone back years. Then we had to show our IDs. We're frisked and told to walk through a metal detector, much as one would do in an airport. But that is where the comparison ends. As I emerged through the metal detector, a woman behind a large desk barked, "Wait, I told you to wait. Pay attention. You are not listening to me. Do it again." All I could think to say is, "Yes, ma'am." I certainly did not want to say anything to provoke her. I was learning that not only is it difficult to get out of Sing Sing prison, it's not easy to get in either. Sing Sing is just north of New York City on the Hudson River. In fact, that's where the expression "sent up the river" comes from. Most of the prisoners are from New York City. If you're found guilty of a violent crime, you are sent up the river to Sing Sing, a maximum security facility for those prisoners doing hard time for violent crimes. It is also called the Big House, for reasons I can now understand. I was there at the invitation of Bonnie Roseborough, a United Church of Christ minister, who in addition to her ministry at a church in suburban New York, is a chaplain at Sing Sing prison. In that capacity, she teaches a class offered by New York Theological Seminary for prisoners at Sing Sing. It is the only master's degree program offered in a prison in this country. The members of the class are studying to be ministers, and this particular course is called Foundations of Ministry. It meets for 2.5 hours every Wednesday afternoon on the prison grounds. The students in that class were reading a book I co-authored with another UCC minister, Lillian Daniel, called This Odd and Wondrous Calling. The book offers some personal reflections on the vocation of pastoral ministry. Bonnie Roseborough, or Pastor Bonnie as she's known in the class, invited us to visit the class to talk about the book, and we eagerly accepted the invitation. I tried not to have too many preconceived notions about the members of the class, who had all been found guilty of a violent crime. But I will confess to you that I was not entirely successful in my efforts. Try as I might to stay open, I did have something of a picture. I pictured that the men in the class would be hardened by their experience, guarded, maybe sullen or cynical, perhaps even scornful of these two suburban ministers coming to meet with them. After all, what would we have to say that would be of interest or of relevance to their lives? As we waited for all the security measures to be completed, I asked Bonnie, "What do the men in the class make of our coming today?" She replied, "Oh, they're really looking forward to it. They have so little interaction with the outside world. They often feel forgotten, invisible, locked up, with the key thrown away." Finally, we were cleared for entrance. We were escorted through many doors that all shut behind us with a decisive clang. When we arrived at the room where the class is taught, it looked like a basement room in an old church where there's a lot of deferred maintenance. Cinder block walls, peeling paint, a leaky steam radiator that hissed like a snake. But I only saw that later. What I saw at first were the prisoners who got up to shake our hands, to thank us for coming, to ask, "Would you like a glass of water or some tea?" I just wasn't expecting that. We sat down. Pastor Bonnie introduced us to the class and then asked the prisoners to introduce themselves. The man in the group who has served the least time has been in Sing Sing for 15 years, others much longer. At least one man had been in that prison for over 30 years. I try to remember what I was doing 30 years ago. Some are serving life sentences. The members of the class had prepared for our visit, and the prisoner's first question was about the basis of pastoral authority. I have learned from my work with seminarians and new pastors that this is often the question that infuses much of those early years of ministry. I still found it curious that this was the first question in that setting. But then Bonnie asked the members of the class, "What are the signs of authority here?" "Handcuffs, badges, nightsticks," one man said. "Guns, mace," said another. So yes, what is the source of a pastor's authority when you don't have any of those things? Whatever preconceived notions I brought with me disappeared almost instantly. We were warmly welcomed by the men in the class. They were eager to engage with the book and with us. Several of the men were so articulate if you closed your eyes, you might think you were in a seminary classroom at Yale or Andover Newton. When Pastor Bonnie asked the class near the very end, "What is your definition of evil?" One student, gave a definition that was so thoughtful and brilliantly phrased that Bonnie came back, "George, did you get that answer from a catechism or something?" He said, "No, I got it from my head." At one point, one of the men said, "So, Martin, in the book you wrote about your wife, how is she? And did she ever go back to that room where she made the banners for worship?" Which is a story I had told in the book. He wanted to know how the story ended. Another man asked, "Lillian, how is your son with diabetes?" We also learned that the prisoners had raised over $6,000 for a local food pantry from the 22 cents an hour they received for doing menial work. They had earned enough money to provide back-to-school kits, including items like pencils and even backpacks for each child who visits the prison. One of the members of the class challenged us, "What are you or your church doing to guide the youth? I think there is a crisis among the youth today." Here on the inside, he was challenging us to tend to those on the outside. He was concerned about justice, and not merely criminal justice. Now, I'm not going to draw any grand conclusions from my experience. I do not know if these men should be in prison. I do not know if they received justice. I do not have a well-informed understanding of our penal system. I am sure that aspects of prison life are very different from what I experienced in that room. But this, at least, I know. During my visit to Sing Sing, it was this particular question of Jesus that I carried with me. Somehow smuggled it in through security. And that is a good thing, because I could not have left the question behind if I tried. Referring to the sinner before him, Jesus asked, "Do you see this woman?" That is the question that whispered in my ear as we met with the men in the class. Do you see this man? Can you clear away the stereotypes and the preconceptions and the condemnations long enough to see this man? After all, the thick and towering walls of the prison are not the only thing preventing you from seeing these men. As the time approached for the class to end, one of the students spoke up and said, "I'm sorry, Pastor Bonnie, but we have only 15 minutes to go. I want to make sure we get our books signed before it's too late. Then, if we've got some time, we can come back to this discussion." And at that, they all stood up and formed a kind of a line. They all wanted their books signed. I signed each book with each man's name and these words: "With every good wish and best blessing, Martin." And unlike other times when I've signed books, after I finished writing in each book, I did not remain seated. I stood up from the table to shake each man's hand. I wanted to be able to look each one in the eyes. I wanted, for once, as best I could, to be able to answer Jesus' question. Do you see this man?